All the great houses of the Ironborn claim descent from the Grey King and his sons, save curiously the good brothers of Old Wick and Great Wick, who supposedly derive from the Grey King's little eldest brother. Hey everyone, Crowfoot's daughter here, and if you clicked on this video, you have reached the Disputed Lands. I'd like to congratulate Ulf Beauregard, who was our winner of the Lands of Ice and Fire giveaway, which was also announced on Twitter. Congratulations, Ulf, and your package should be making its way to you shortly. So today, I've returned with another video essay. I've had some assumptions for a while now, and I've found evidence that will cause you to second guess how you've been viewing the Grey King, House Goodbrother, and Garth the Greenhand, which I will be sharing with you. According to legends, Garth the Greenhand was a famous progenitor of the First Men, fathering the founders of various noble houses of the Reach, and has even been linked to noble houses outside the Reach, through heroes such as Brandon of the Bloody Blade and Lan the Clever. As you might have noticed, Garth's description is quite peculiar. In the oldest tales, he is named Garth Greenhair, or simply Garth the Green. Some stories say he had green hands, green hair, or green skin overall. A few even give him antlers like a stag. So when we see the description of Garth with all his greenness and antlers, we quickly see a very likely linkage to the old gods and the children of the forest, as there is an uncanny similarity to the description of the green men of the God's Eye. Maybe he came from the Isle of Faces, said Bran. Was he green? In Old Nan stories, the Guardians had green skin and leaves instead of hair. Sometimes they had antlers too. In addition to possibly being green with antlers, the World Book gave us a huge information dump on Garth, which detailed some heavy connotations with nature and trees. It seems Garth was famous for making the land bloom, showing the first men how to farm, and planting the seeds which contain the beginnings for all the world's trees. Garth is also said to have planted the intertwining weirwoods of Highgarden, known as the Three Singers. His descendants of House Gardener even sat upon a living tree throne known as the Oaken Seat, from an oak Garth is said to have planted himself. Besides all of the tree guy green man symbolism, Garth is also associated with fertility, life, and virility. Some tales argue that he was more god than man, and lived for 1,000 years. Garth was said to not only bring about fertility upon the landscape, but also increase fertility in women. Tales mention maidens would flower in his presence, old women regained fecundity, and women would bring forth twins, even triplets. Now, knowing these tidbits, it's easy to see one of the mythological inspirations for Garth the Green is most certainly the pagan fertility god Cernunnos, who is also a fertility god, is also depicted as green, and also depicted with antlers. Cernunnos is best known as the horned god of the animals in the Green Man, guardian of the green world. Although he has this animalistic antler-wearing aspect, Cernunnos is also a tree, forest, and vegetation god in his folate aspect, and is also depicted as the Green Man. In addition to Cernunnos, the horned fertility god is a theme found in many ancient cultures, which our writer has also drawn from. Two pagan holidays associated with Cernunnos are winter and summer solstice. It is during these times that summer and winter do battle. In this seasonal struggle, summer is personified by the Oak King and winter by the Holly King. In these tales, one king defeats or kills the other each year to bring about the changing of the seasons. The defeated king regenerates in the off-season and comes back to defeat the other, thus maintaining the cycle of seasons. In some tales, Oak and Holly are each aspects of Cernunnos. In other tales, they are separate kings, often depicted as brothers battling endlessly as the seasons turn. Since we are aware that our writer has drawn from Cernunnos, is it also possible he drew from Oak and Holly when he developed the Garth legend? A few of the very oldest tales of Garth Greenhand present us with a considerably darker deity, one who demanded blood sacrifice from his worshippers to ensure a bountiful harvest. In some stories, the green god dies every autumn when the trees lose their leaves, only to be reborn again with the coming of the spring. Now just remember that Oak and Holly were also said to be brothers, because this is going to be important. So in addition to the tale of Garth the Greenhand, the World Book also retells the legend of the first king and the great Barrow, which states, A curse was placed on the great Baelor that would allow no living man to rival the first king. This curse made these pretenders to the title grow corpse-like in their appearance as it sucked away their vitality and life. Wow. This first king guy seems as though he has some sort of magical control over life and vitality. Does that sound like someone we know? I was quite intrigued by this curse after realizing there were also legends that recount Garth the Green as the first king of the First Men. Garth was the High King of the First Men, it is written. It was he who led them out of the east and across the land bridge to Westeros. Yet other tales would have us believe that he preceded the arrival of the First Men by thousands of years, making him not only the first man in Westeros, but the only man, wandering the length and breadth of the land and treating with the giants and the children of the forest. Some even say he was a god. So being that Garth was the fabled first king by many accounts, I had quickly realized it is very possible the first king who is buried in the Great Baelor and Garth the Green could in fact be one and the same. The Curse of the First King has fascinated me for years. Each time I read the Iron Islands chapter of the World Book, I was reminded of this corpse-like curse each time the Grey King was mentioned. In the Age of Heroes, the legends say, the Ironborn were ruled by a mighty monarch, known simply as the Grey King. The Grey King ruled the sea itself, and took a mermaid to wife, so his sons and daughters might live above the waves or beneath them as they chose. His hair and beard and eyes were as grey as a winter's sea, and from these he took his name. From there he ruled the Iron Islands for 1,000 years, until his very skin had turned as grey as his hair and beard. Similar to Garth, the Grey King had an abnormally long lifespan of 1,000 years, and was also said to be godlike. From the description, it seems the Ironborn were ruled by a guy who was more corpse than a man, who just kept getting old. In stark contrast to Garth's green hair and skin, which is a color associated with life and fertility, the Grey King is the visual polar opposite, with gray skin, eyes, and hair, a color associated with old age and death. In fact, the Grey King and the Drowned God religion are easily identifiable with death. What is dead can never die is a mantra of the Ironborn religion itself. In contrast to the great feats of Garth the Green, the greatest feats of the Grey King included literally killing trees. He is said to have carved the first longship from the pale wood of a demonic tree that fed on human flesh. This, of course, is an obvious reference to weirwood, being that weirwoods have pale wood and are subject to offerings of blood sacrifice. The Grey King also brought fire to the earth by taunting the storm god, who answered with a thunderbolt, causing a tree to burn. The Grey King is also credited with the slaying of not just a demonic weirwood, but he is also claimed to have killed the sea dragon Naga, whose bones are also speculated to be petrified weirwood. So again, the Grey King slayed another demonic tree. This time it was Naga. If you're not familiar with the concept of Naga being weirwood, my next video will be covering that subject. So when you read the tale of the Grey King sitting on a throne made of Naga, think of it in this sense. The Grey King sat upon the bones of a dead demonic weirwood he had conquered. So, as I have been mentioning, what we see between Garth and the Grey King is something called an inverse parallel. They're foils of each other, opposites if you will. We see Garth was a green man, a planter of weirwoods, and was supposed to be the planter for the makings of all the trees and plants, whose descendants sat on a living tree throne Garth planted himself. And then on the other hand, we have the Grey King, who was a grey man, literally killing trees in his myth, and sitting on weirwood bones he was said to have slain. In addition, the culture of the Old Way also shuns the practice of farming and considers the agrarian lifestyle Garth had taught to be disgraceful. In fact, the direct descendants of the Grey King we are most familiar with, House Greyjoy, is endowed with the famous house words, "We do not sow." Additionally, the Lord of the Iron Islands is referred to as Lord Reaper of Pike. The use of the word reaper can be used to describe both death or the taking of crops where the Ironborn are concerned. And when battle was joined upon the shores, mighty kings and famous warriors fell before the reavers like wheat before a scythe, in such numbers that the men of the green lands told each other that the Ironborn were demons risen from some watery hell. In addition to the Grey King myth, the Ironborn themselves are notorious for their killing of trees. I mean big time. These guys had cut down so many trees on the Iron Islands, they then had to turn to the green lands for wood. This would have been a huge violation in the eyes of the Greensayers, especially if they were using weirwood, as the Ironborn legends suggest. I would say this is bad news all around for the tree-worshipping Greenland folk on so many levels. It was a need for wood that first set the Ironborn on this bloody path. In the dawn of days, there were extensive forests on Great Wick, Harlaw, and Orkmont, but the shipwrights of the Isles had such a voracious need for lumber that one by one the woods vanished. So the Ironborn had no choice but to turn to the vast forests of the Greenlands. You've told me the children of the forest had the green side. I remember. Some claim to have that power. Their wise men were called Greenseers. Was it magic? Call it that for want of a better word, if you must. At heart, it was only a different sort of knowledge. What was it? Luwin set down his quill. No one truly knows, Bran. The children are gone from this world, and their wisdom with them. It had to do with the faces in the trees, we think. The first men believed that the Greenseers could see through the eyes of the werewoods. That was why they cut down the trees whenever they warred upon the children. Now, don't get me wrong. The Ironborn grieve because they lack the fundamental resources. Life on the islands is bleak, tough, and short. The Grey King responded to his surroundings by adapting a culture that could survive on this landscape, which was most likely caused by the drowning of the waters. What you see in the overall symbolism of the Ironborn is very much an opposing force to fertility, life, and warmth. Instead, you see grey, death, iron, reaping. As LML has pointed out in his essay entitled The Grey King and the Sea Dragon, which I've linked below, the Wayward Bride chapter really illustrates this Ironborn versus tree symbolism. Our writer went out of his way to show the trees as somehow menacing to the Ironborn. He constantly gave the surrounding trees the illusion of being their foes. The woods were on the move, creeping toward the castle like a slow green tide. She thought back to a tale she had heard as a child about the children of the forest and their battles with the first men, when the Greenseers turned the trees to warriors. Asha cursed beneath her breath, wondering if it had been a mistake to leave the castle. No. If we had stayed and fought, we might all be dead by now. But it was no good blundering through the dark either. These trees will kill us if they can. Beside him, Lauren Longax sprawled with one leg twisted under him, and the shadows kept on coming, shouting and rustling. We're fighting shrubbery, Asha thought, as she slew a man who had more leaves on him than most of the surrounding trees. Tall soldier pines and gnarled old oaks closed in around them. Deepwood was aptly named. The trees were huge and dark, somehow threatening. Their limbs wove through one another and creaked with every breath of wind, and their higher branches scratched at the face of the moon. The sooner we are out of here, the better I will like it, Asha thought. The trees hate us all, deep in their wooden hearts. Let's follow this up and look at a particular Ironborn sigil for a moment. George R.R. Martin is a self-proclaimed heraldry enthusiast, and every so often makes use of sigils to hint at mysteries in the world he has created. The sigil I would draw your attention to is that of House Orkwood of Orkmont. House Orkwood's sigil is very peculiar for an Ironborn house, because it's a sigil of trees. And the Ironborn aren't very famous for their trees, are they? Now, give yourself a moment to ponder on this house's name for a bit. Orkwood. If you love fantasy, you probably already know an orc is essentially another way of saying a demon or a monster. I think the most popularly referenced concept of an orc can be found in Tolkien's writings, where he describes orcs as a race of grotesque flesh-eating savage fighters. Old English glossaries record the word orc corresponding with the Latin orcus, that is synonymous with ogre as well as hell devil. So having a house Orcwood is kind of the same as saying orc wood or demon wood. In a sense, the author is giving us a gentle nudge with this sigil and cunningly displaying the Ironborn's version of a demon, which is a perfect match for the Great King's myth when he slayed a demonic tree. As we have learned from the World Book, all of the major Ironborn houses claim to be descendants of the Great King, all except for House Goodbrother, who claim to be descendants of the Great King's brother. When I read this curiosity, I truly found myself asking, why? It's a subtle and seemingly unnecessary bit of information that's been fit in there. I mean, first we learned the Great King had a brother. Second, we learned there's a sole surviving house descended from this brother. When I began my analysis, I had expected to find the familiar death symbols of the Ironborn. But instead, I found something very, very different. I found fertility, and some other ideas that hint at fratricide. Let's look at how the senior branch of House Goodbrother is introduced for the very first time in the series. Lord Goodbrother of Great Wick had come in the night before with his main strength, near 40 longships. His men were everywhere, conspicuous in their striped goat's hair sashes. It was said about the inn that Otter Gipney's horse were being bow-legged by beardless boys in sashes. So, when the Goodbrothers are introduced in the series, the Goodbrothers are described as being everywhere. Then in the same passage, the beardless boys, also known as green boys, are engaging in a whole lot of sexy time. Right from the get-go, I found the goat's hair sashes to be completely bizarre. Goat hair is not mentioned to be worn by any other characters in the books, so the writer made this accessory chiefly unique to this house, and this house alone. So some digging was done, and sure enough, the goat is a fertility symbol. As previously mentioned, Garth was heavily inspired by Cernunnos, who has counterparts in many European cultures and deities, one of which is the Greek Pan, who was a half-man, half-goat figure. Essentially, the goat man is just another approximation of the stag man that symbolizes fertility and ceaseless energy. So therefore, in their debut, in addition to depicting the Goodbrothers as being everywhere and having lots of sex, we also learn the members of House Goodbrother all wear a symbol of fertility as well. With all of this, it seems to me the Goodbrothers are meant to be associated with fertility, something that's kind of pounded home right from the get-go in their introduction. We also later learn the head of House Goodbrother, Gorald Goodbrother, was given 12 daughters and 3 sons who are triplets. 15 kids are quite a lot of children, even for Westerosi standards, and triplets are almost unheard of. Triplets are quite literally not seen anywhere else in the books. Even though we see no other examples of triplets in the series, there is mention of triplets in the World Book in one spot, The Legend of Garth. Let's take a look. Garth Greenhand brought the gift of fertility with him. Nor was it only the earth he made fecund, for the legends tell that he could make bare women fruitful with a touch, even crones whose moonblood no longer flowed. Maidens ripened in his presence. Mothers brought forth twins, even triplets when he blessed them. Young girls flowered at his smile. So Gorald Goodbrother has 15 children that include a set of triplets, the only known instance of this in the series. The next time we see House Goodbrother, Aeron is on the shores of Great Wick drowning people and is given news of the death of his brother Baelon. King Baelon's death is of course an example of one brother killing another, as we later learn. But before Aeron is privy to information surrounding his brother's death, he must travel to the keep of the Goodbrother Senior Branch. Let's take a look at how the lands are described. The way was rough, up hills and woods and stony defiles, along a narrow track that oft seemed to disappear beneath the horse's hoofs. Great Wick was the largest of the Iron Islands, so vast that some of the lords had holdings that did not front upon the Holy See. Gorald Goodbrother was one such. His keep was in the Hardstone Hills, as far away from the Drowned God's realm as any place in the Isles. Gerald's folk toiled in Gerald's mines, in the stony dark beneath the earth. Some lived and died without ever setting eyes upon salt water. Small wonder such folk are crabbed and queer. In this passage, the writer is portraying there is something a little off or unique with this place. It is during Aeron's trek we learn the holdfast of the Good Brother Senior Branch is so far away from the Drowned God's realm. There are some who do not even set eyes on the sea their entire lives, and are described as being crabbed and queer. This is really just about the closest approximation to the Greenlands possible, being so far away from the sea, with a people viewed as somehow set apart. Interestingly, this is also the first mention I have seen of woods on the Iron Islands, a place known for their lack of trees. So with the lands of House Goodbrother, we have a crabbed and queer people living in a wooded region who toil beneath the earth, some of whom die without ever setting eyes upon the sea. It was long after dark by the time the priest espied the spiky battlements of the Hammerhorn clawing at the crescent moon. Gorald's keep was hulking and blocky, its great stones quarried from the cliff that loomed behind it. Below its walls, the entrances of caves and ancient mines yawned like toothless black mouths. The Hammerhorn's iron gates had been closed and barred for the night. Here we have Gorald's battlements, clawing at the crescent moon, which is an echo of the trees in the Wayward Bride chapter, and later echoed again with the Weirwood of the Nightfort. So we have trees alluded to as scratching the moon, weirwoods alluded to as pulling the moon down, and this guy's keep as clawing at the face of the moon. Below that keep, we find the entrances of caves. Our author has outwardly taken the time to mention caves and hollow hills under certain old places that have connections with the old gods. This has been the case so much, in fact, there's been some healthy discussion and cataloging of this phenomena in the forums. And to that list, you can add Hammerhorn Keep. If you're familiar with Lucifer Means Lightbringer, you will know that Hammerhorn is actually a pretty good clue about the Hammer of the Waters. The Hammerhorn's spiky iron is clawing at the moon, connecting the idea of the moon being attacked and pulled down with hammers and horns. Essentially, hammers have been associated with storm gods quite a lot. Thor is probably the most recognizable example of this. This symbolism is why we have our Storm Lord Robert wielding a hammer. Also, there is the belief that horns are connected to the drowning of the waters. LML has some pretty top-notch analysis on this topic in his Great King podcast, so be sure to check that out. One thing that I would like to add is that horns are also universally recognized as a symbol of fertility, which ties back to the Horned Lord mythos that dates back to the Greeks, Romans, Celts, and even the Baal-worshipping Canaanites. The sigil of House Goodbrother is, of course, a war horn, and their keep is the Hammerhorn. Later, when Aeron enters the keep, he is offered a horn of ale by one of Gorald's 15 children, and is met by both Lord Goodbrother and his maester. He learns of Euron's attempts to claim the throne, and they discuss succession, and then Aeron is then escorted back to the sea by Gorald's son Gwydion. I would like to add that the only other character within A Song of Ice and Fire with the name Gwydion was a Gwydion gardener, an old gardener king. With House Goodbrother, the fertility symbolism is there, and so are the Greenland references. Knowing this much, would you be surprised to see a little fratricidal brother versus brother stuff? First, we should remember that the entire trip to the Goodbrother Keep was to learn of the death of Aeron Greyjoy, which we later deduce is due to kinslaying. As Aeron is escorted back to the sea, he drifts to sleep and wakes to think of his brother Uri, who died of a hand wound he obtained while playing the finger dance. It seems Aeron has inadvertently blamed himself for his brother's death, as it was his throwing axe that dealt the blow. It had been his axe that sheared off Uri's hand, whilst they danced the finger dance as friends and brothers will. It shamed him still to recall the years that followed Uri's death. Then his mind turns to Euron. Gwydion interrupts his thoughts and asks, "Will it come to war?" asked Gwydion Goodbrother as the sun was lightening the hills. "A war of brother against brother? If the drowned god wills it, no godless man may sit the sea stone chair. The crow's eye will fight, that is certain." Aeron then arrives on the shore, and Gwydion departs, and he goes on to preach to the small folk. What happens the very next time we see the good brothers? Oh yeah, we see two brothers fighting. The tent grew hot and smoky. Two of Gorld Goodbrother's sons knocked a table over fighting. Will Humble lost a wager and had to eat his boot. Little Lenwood Tawny fiddled, whilst Romney Weaver sang The Bloody Cup and Steel Rain and other raving songs. Even in the World Book, directly before we learn about the Good Brothers, we are privy to a tale about kinslaying. Brother killed brother in an orgy of kinslaying until only 16 remained. These last survivors divided up the islands between them. All the great houses of the Ironborn claimed descent from the Grey King and his sons, save curiously the good brothers of Oldwyck and Greatwyck, who supposedly derive from the Grey King's leal eldest brother. As you can see, the writer goes straight from a kinslaying orgy to House Goodbrother in one quick swoop. Just take a look at how the Good Brothers are used in the books. They're used sparingly, but when you find them, you will see a message is trying to be sent about fertility and brothers fighting. When they're not given kinslaying or fertility symbolism, you will see allusions to the Hammer of the Waters. House Goodbrother also has a ton of cadet branches. It's just another nod to abundance, with telltale names such as Crowspike Keep, Down Delving, Corpse Lake, and Shatterstone, which are again, as LML has pointed out, allusions to the Hammer of the Waters. The only cadet branch that does not have this Hammer of the Waters naming convention is a House Goodbrother of Orkmont. So we're doing pretty good so far, and I've set up a few basic concepts. But I know at this point you're probably still skeptical. However, this last half of the video, I'm going to start connecting a few things, and I'm going to try to blow your mind. So stick with me here, and hopefully you'll thank me for this. So let's take a moment to look at Victarion and Euron. In this brotherly dynamic, Victarion despises his brother. In fact, I personally feel this guy holds more enmity and hatred towards his sibling than any other character in the present timeline. And that's saying quite a bit. Really, from the moment Euron returns, the only thing on Victarion's mind is killing his brother. Victarion would not speak of kinslaying. Here in this godly place, beneath the bones of Naga in the Grey King's Hall, but many a night he dreamed of driving a mailed fist into Euron's smiling face, until the flesh split and his bad blood ran red and free. But what holds Victarion back from killing Euron? His thoughts on kinslaying. They say it is accursed. Would you have me fight the Crow's Eye? Brother against brother? Ironborn against Ironborn? Euron was still his elder, no matter how much bad blood might be between them. No man is as accursed as the kinslayer. Victarion's hands clenched into fists. He had beaten 4 men to death with those hands, and 1 wife as well. Though his hair was flecked with hoarfrost, he was as strong as he had ever been, with a bull's broad chest and a boy's flat belly. The kinslayer is accursed in the eyes of gods and men. Baelon had reminded him on the day he sent the Crow's Eye off to sea. In these passages, we see Victarion's inner mantra is being played out again and again. No man is as accursed as the kinslayer. He drank in the darkness, brooding on his brother. If I do not strike the blow with mine own hand, am I still a kinslayer? Victarion feared no man, but the drowned god's curse gave him pause. If another strikes him down at my command, will his blood still stain my hands? So now we see mention of a curse again, and it has to do with kinslaying. Victarion describes it as the Drowned God's curse, but we see mention of this saying among other Westerosi quite often. No man is as accursed as the kinslayer. Could this saying have an actual historical significance that has been lost through time? Could this saying stem from an ancient battle between two brothers? Yes, I believe the curse of the First King had to do with the Garth-type figure and the Great King. The Holly King slew his brother the Oak King, and Garth in turn cursed his brother's vitality. An excellent hint and allusion to this curse is in the death of Renly Baratheon. As you will see, Renly is personified as a very obvious Summer Oak Garth figure, with his forest green armor and antlers. Renly is also described as the Green Knight by Sansa. If you're familiar with Arthurian legend, you might be familiar with a character called the Green Knight. Many scholars believe the Celtic Green Man, as in Sir Nunos, to be the inspiration and precursor for this character. I can answer, Sansa said quickly to quell her prince's anger. She smiled at the Green Knight. Your helmet bears golden antlers, my lord. The stag is a sigil of your royal house. King Robert has 2 brothers. By your extreme youth, you can only be Renly Baratheon. Beside the entrance, the king's armor stood sentry, a suit of forest green plate, its fittings chased with gold. The helm crowned by a great rack of golden antlers. The steel was polished to such a high sheen that she could see her reflection in the breastplate, gazing back at her as if from the bottom of a deep green pond. And now, for some really great parallelism, directly after Renly's death, the very next time we see Stannis, he is noticeably older and corpse-like. And can you take one guess at what color he's wearing? Stannis wore a gray wool tunic, a dark red mantle, and a plain black leather belt, from which his sword and dagger hung. A red gold crown with flame-shaped points encircled his brows. The look of him was a shock. He seemed 10 years older than the man that Davos had left at Storm's End when they set sail for the Blackwater and the battle that would be their undoing. The king's close-cropped beard was spider-webbed with gray hairs. He had dropped 2 stone or more of weight. He had never been a fleshy man, but now the bones moved beneath his skin like spears, fighting to cut free. Even his crown seemed too large for his head. His eyes were blue pits lost in deep hollows, and the shape of a skull could be seen beneath his face. The king was often occupied. Davos learned from his son Devon, one of the royal squires. Now that Stannis Baratheon had come into his power, the lordlings buzzed around him like flies around a corpse. He looks half a corpse, too, years older than when I left Dragonstone. Devon said the king scarcely slept of late. Since Lord Renly died, he has been troubled by terrible nightmares. So directly after he kills his brother, who wears green and wears antlers, Stannis then dons a gray king costume by wearing gray, with newfound gray hairs and looking like a corpse. In this next passage, we have Theon Turncloak, Theon Kinslayer. And although he did not actually kill his foster brothers, he did forsake the Stark family that had raised him. Theon overran Winterfell and became a pretender to the King of the North, sitting in the high Stark seat. Later, he was cast down, and through various deprivations, such as castration, he became the epitome of infertility, and his house words, "We do not sow," and undergoes a gray transformation of his own, becoming very much corpse-like himself. Also, pay close attention to the mentioning of hammering and Barrowton. Theon wore black and gold, his cloak pinned to his shoulder by a crude iron kraken that a smith in Barrowton had hammered together for him. But under the hood, his hair was white and thin, and his flesh had an old man's grayish undertone. Now this is where it gets interesting. If it is what I think it is, what we are really looking at with this curse is the age-old brother versus brother archetype. Basically, Cain and Abel. Fascinatingly, the Cain and Abel trope appears in various versions throughout literature and folklore. In the Bible story, Cain slew his brother, and in retaliation, God placed a curse upon Cain and marked him, so that living became his punishment. Although Cain was once a farmer, God also cursed the ground that was soiled with his brother's blood, so that wherever Cain went, he could no longer sow the earth or draw his own harvest. So basically, Cain could no longer sow. The curse God gave him was perpetual suffering, as well as infertility of the land. The drought showed no signs of ending, and the small folk by the thousands had taken to the roads, looking for some place where the rains still fell. Lord Bloodraven had commanded them to return to their own lands and lords, but few obeyed. Many blamed Bloodraven and King Ares for the drought. It was a judgment from the gods, they said, for the kinslayer is accursed. Interestingly, that is just the biblical version of Cain. Still, other tales and versions exist. One tale from Celtic folklore suggests Cain was forced by God to become Anku, the hooded grim harvester of souls. Yes, Cain in some tales is the Grim Reaper himself. Now you know where all the death and reaping symbols are coming from. If the name Abel sounds familiar, it is because this is the name Mance Rayder had taken when he went to Winterfell. Mance, you know, the same guy with the antlers crowning his tent when he was introduced in the series? Mance, of course, took the moniker Abel as a tribute to Bael the Bard. So, a little background information here. In Middle Eastern mythology, Mot was a Canaanite death god, another harvester of souls, if you will. Mot's rival was his brother Bael, a horned god of fertility and storms. Bael is interestingly one of the very first known horned fertility gods, and like Oakenholly and like Cernunnos, Bael was believed to die in the fall and resurrect in the spring, to bring fertility back to the world. Bael's death and resurrection is so key to his stories, it is described as the Bael cycle. In the Bael cycle, Mot kills his brother Bael, and Mot in turn becomes mutilated. After a time, both gods are restored and resume battle once again, bringing about the changing of the seasons. So basically, one of the most key aspects to the Bael myth is him being killed by his brother, who is a personification of death. So let's look at the story of Bael the Bard. If this pattern holds true, if it holds any water, we should see some hints, right? Some hints at kinslaying maybe, or something similar to what I'm suggesting? Let's take a look. 30 years later, when Bael was king beyond the wall and led the free folk south, it was young Lord Stark who met him at the frozen ford and killed him. For Bael would not harm his own son when they met sword to sword. So the son slew the father instead, said Jon. Aye, she said. But the gods hate kinslayers even when they kill unknowing. When Lord Stark returned from the battle and his mother saw Bael's head upon a spear, she threw herself from a tower in her grief. So what about some other Bael-type characters? We know Baelor Breakspear was killed by his brother in the Ashford tourney. Additionally, our crown of flowers wearing Baelor the Blessed also had a death plagued by rumors of kinslaying. Lady Maya of House Stokeworth suggested that Viserys poisoned the king in order to finally gain the throne after a decade and more of waiting. Others have suggested that Viserys poisoned Baelor for the good of the realm. What about Aeron Greyjoy? He was killed by his brother Euron. Baelor Blacktide was also killed by Euron, which we'll get to in a little bit. Just know that although Euron is not Baelor's brother, Euron is the perfect guy to be killing someone named Baelor. What about Baelon Targaryen? You know, Baelon the Brave? The Spring Prince who was the next in line for the Iron Throne? Now, I'm not saying this is for certain, but that burst belly is starting to look mighty suspicious. In 100 AC, Baelon was named Hand of the King, succeeding the position after Sir Ryan Redwine had been fired. Baelon served admirably, but tragedy struck a year later, in 101 AC, when during a hunting trip, Baelon complained of a stitch in his side. He died within days of a burst belly. As you may already know, Baelon was next in line for the Iron Throne, and his death was what spurred on the events that caused the Great Council of 101. Basically, the Bael names tend to follow this pattern or provide an allusion to kinslaying in some form or fashion, just like this prime example right here. Sir Baelon's unease was plain. Donal erred, but he is Tommen's man now, you have my word. It's not Sir Donal the Constant who concerns me. It's you. Jaime leaned forward. What will you do if brave Sir Donal gives his sword to yet another usurper, and one day comes storming into the throne room, and there you stand, all in white, between your king and your blood? What will you do? My lord, that will never happen. It happened to me, Jaime said. Swan wiped his brow with the sleeve of his white tunic. You have no answer? My lord, Sir Baelon drew himself up. On my sword, on my honor, on my father's name, I swear I shall not do as you did. As it so happens, Sir Baelon and Sir Donal are also brothers, and they bear a sigil of two swans that appear to be fighting. So now you know what is going on with all of these Bael-type names. Here are a few more interesting things dealing with imagery before we move on. So, Baelor the Blessed is said to have worn a crown made of flowers and vines. You know who else is associated with crowns of flowers and vines? Garth, who also made the land bloom, and his direct descendant Garth Gardener wore a crown of flowers and vines. And what color do you think Baelor Breakspear was wearing when he was introduced in the Hedge Knight? His house colors of red and black? Now, try again. Though he was dressed very plainly, in green doublet, brown mantle, and scuffed boots, there was a weight to him, a sense of power and certainty. And guess what color Baelor Blacktide wears when we see him? Baelor Blacktide was more difficult to please. He sat by Victarion's elbow in his lamb's wool tunic of black and green berry, smooth-faced and comely. In fact, the sigil of House Blacktide is green and black berry, which is a patterned bell shape, and Bel, spelled B-E-L, is an epithet that means Lord, and just so happens to be another cognate of Bael. So Baelor Blacktide has a sigil with a little hint inside of it. If what I'm suggesting could be true, then the Grey King was not always grey. Before this transformation, I believe there's a good chance he might have looked quite a bit like his brother, a Garth-type person, if you will. I mean, the two were related, and brothers do have a knack for looking similar, right? As I mentioned earlier, George R.R. Martin is a self-proclaimed heraldry lover, and every so often he's been found to hide some subtle clues in the occasional house crest or sigil. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the sigil of House Greyiron, the extinct house of the very first Driftwood King. This sigil is supposed to depict the head of the Sea King. Despite the depth the world book covered in the history and lore of the Iron Islands, we have heard nothing of the so-called Sea King. Who we do learn about, however, was the Grey King, who is said to have ruled the sea itself. Now, ruling the sea itself. Well, if you rule the sea itself, then that would make you the king of the sea. Or said another way, the Sea King. Knowing this, I quickly realized we may have actually been provided with a mugshot of the Grey King before this transformation. And as you can tell, there are some striking similarities. Now, remember what I was mentioning about the Oak King and the Holly King? There is also the Sumerian tale of Emesh and Enten. Many scholars have pointed to the similarities of this tale and that of Cain and Abel, and suggest that Emesh and Enten was a precursor providing the framework for the biblical version, because we see two brothers bringing an offering to their god, and the two brothers begin quarreling when one offering is preferred over the other. Think of it in a sense as the origin story, if you will. What you may find thought-provoking is just like Oak and Holly, in the Sumerian tale, Emesh is the embodiment of summer, and Enten, the embodiment of winter, giving us a fascinating link between Cain and Abel and the battling brothers of opposing seasons, because in their origin, Cain and Abel are indeed summer and winter. As I have been detailing, the Grey King myth really seems to bring home the idea of a man in conflict or struggle with trees, and the representation of the Grey King and the Iron Islands culture seems to convey death symbology. Unsurprisingly, in Celtic mythology, there is a god named Aeron, and like the Grim Reaper and like Mot, Aeron is yet another death god, a king of the underworld who has also been linked to inspiring portions of the Arthurian Green Knight legend. If this name sounds familiar, that is because the writer has included a pretty important Ironborn named Aeron Greyjoy into the present storyline. In one story, Aeron was a rival of Gwydion, whose name means born of trees. There is a very peculiar tale between Aeron and Gwydion, and that is the Battle of the Trees, a poem detailing the struggle between a death god and a tree-loving deity. In this tale, Gwydion enchants the trees of the forest to rise up as warriors against Aeron's army. If this theme sounds familiar, you may be aware that the use of trees as warriors is a common one, utilized by various fantasy writers, including George R.R. Martin, illustrated by the Wayward Bride chapter. A great allusion or analog to this kinslaying, tree-hating archetype can be found in the story of Eric the Kinslayer, which is providing yet another whiff of this theme. In this same era, one Andal, remembered in legend as Eric the Kinslayer, came across the great hill of High Heart. There, while under the protection of the kings of the first men, the children of the forest had tended to the mighty carved weirwoods that crowned it. When Eric's warriors sought to cut down the trees, the first men are said to have fought beside the children, but the might of the Andals was too great. Though the children of the first men made a valiant effort to defend their grove, all were slain. So what we have in the Grey King is by and large the embodiment of a death god, a grim reaper if you will, that is highlighted through tons of death, infertility, and reaping symbols to drive the concept home. He is also an adversary to the fertility god, the storm god, the enchanter of trees, and we also see a curse for kinslaying deaths played out in the tale of Cain, with some connections to a kinslaying curse in the storyline that is highlighted by Victorian's comments. Fertility and death in myth and folklore are natural enemies of sorts that you will see repeated time and time again, demonstrated in the Horn God and Corn King myths such as Cernunnos, Bael, Emesh and Enten, Oak and Holly. This death and fertility cycle is often illustrated through the use of opposing brothers battling endlessly in a cyclic pattern to maintain the natural order of the seasons. As you may have noticed, brother versus brother is a recurring archetype that can be seen throughout the series. Just a few examples include Bloodraven and Bittersteel, Maegor and Aenys, Maekar and Baelor Breakspear, Daemon Blackfire and Darion, Stannis and Renly, Ramsay and Domeric, the Hound and the Mountain, Aemon the Dragon Knight and Aegon the Unworthy, Euron and Victarion, Euron and Aeron, Euron and Baelon. You see a pattern here with Euron? In the Forsaken chapter, we also learn Euron has killed 2 other brothers in addition to Baelon, which is why Euron is the perfect guy to be killing a guy named Baelor Blacktide. And finally, we have Sir Eric Cargill and Sir Eric Cargill. With these 2 guys, I am just going to take a moment to point out a specific Arthurian tale. Arthurian legends are something that our writer likes to draw from, with nods such as names like Arthur, Uthor, Gawain, and even Dolorous Ed. The specific tale I am referring to is the story of Sir Baelon and Sir Baelon. In the Arthurian legend, these 2 knightly brothers unknowingly kill each other. The tale is a bit more complicated, but for purposes of time, Just know that Sir Baelon and Sir Baelon were brothers whose fratricide is the stuff of legend. This tale is referenced by the author in The Dance of Dragons, where we have Sir Auric and Sir Eric, who were famous Kingsguard knights who also kill one another. In a So Spake Martin on Westeros.org from 1999, a fan was wondering if the Cargill brothers were inspired by the brothers Alric and Eirik from Norwegian king sagas. In response, Martin shot that down, stating he had read Icelandic sagas in the 1960s, but couldn't remember or recall any of the names or titles of any of the characters. And he finished his statement with this: Sir Eric and Sir Eric were inspired by the twin knights of Arthurian myth, Sir Baelon and Sir Baelon, who appear in Mallory. So, fun fact, when you see names like Bael, Baelor, and Baelon, now you know what to be looking for. A future video will cover some great stuff about Baelor the Blessed and the Baelor of Celtic mythology, and yes, we will be covering some fun stuff about kinslaying as well. But let's move on. So, I know what you're thinking. The Grey King and the Ironborn religion already have an arch-nemesis in the Storm God. What is this new information I'm getting about there being some ancient beef with some type of Garth person? Well, the Green Seers and the Storm God are very much interchangeable. Has anyone else ever noticed how Aeron mentions ravens are creatures of the Storm God? I definitely noticed this because ravens, as we all know, are most commonly associated with Green Seers, the old gods and werewoods. The Grey King's multiple examples of the destruction of trees is another hint to the identity of the Ironborn's malign storm god. Examples such as the pale demonic tree egg he had slain and the petrified werewood bones of Naga, whom the Grey King is also said to have slain, actually point to the true identity of this malign deity. We also know most of the drowned god, storm god duality most likely stems from the catastrophic destruction caused by the Hammer of the Waters and the drowning of the Iron Islands. In a nutshell, the Ironborn see the drowning of the waters as a massive storm that was brought on by the storm god that drowned whole islands. Knowing this, if the Green Seers did indeed cause the Hammer of the Waters, then the malign storm god in question would in fact be the Green Seers or old gods. Additionally, we already know the Green Seers speak with the trees and the wind. Therefore, the Green Seers must have at least some control over the wind. You will see time and time again throughout the series, the wind, not just the trees, is trying to tell the characters something, even as soon as the prologue. Just notice when a character like Jon is walking into danger. Watch what the wind does. Tell me what you meant about hearing the gods. Osha studied him. You asked them and they're answering. Open your ears. Listen, you'll hear. Bran listened. It's only the wind, he said after a moment, uncertain. The leaves are rustling. Who do you think sends the wind if not the gods? The symbolism of Renly's duality as a storm king wearing the Garth armor is another hint. Both Garth and the Storm King share antlers in their portrayal. I'm not implying that Doran and Garth are the same guy, but the Storm King is given the antlers for reasons beyond giving certain characters fertility symbols. In addition to this, he gave the Storm King's antlers and wielding hammers in order to visually connect Garth to the storm. He found himself thinking of Robert more and more. He saw the king as he had been in the flower of his youth, tall and handsome, his great antlered helm on his head, his warhammer in hand, sitting his horse like a horned god. I am sure you have seen the posts and theories surrounding the many-faced god, and the concept that there are probably a few gods in the series that are in reality the same, so to speak. This is just a supposition that supports this. So in my interpretation, when the Ironborn speak of the Storm God, what they are referring to is a deity linked to the old gods and Green Seers. In essence, this Garth-type figure is very much like the god Bael, who is not merely associated with fertility, but also storms. So let's take a look at this passage. A storm, he realized, or else I'm even drunker than I knew. He retched the wine up and lay in it a while, wondering if the ship would sink. Is this your vengeance, Father? Has the Father above made you his hand? Such are the wages of the kinslayer, he said as the wind howled outside. The wording in this quote is interesting. We see a little tie-in with storms and kinslaying, as though a storm is the wrath and punishment for kinslaying. And Tyrion mentions the storm being the hand of punishment. There is a little bit of some symbolic play here because the descendants most associated with Garth, House Gardener, utilized a hand for their sigil, and even in Garth's name there is a connection with hand. So in Tyrion mentioning that the storm is caused by the hand punishing, we see a little bit of interplay here, which is echoed by the Ironborn sigil of House Kenning, the only depiction we have of the storm god, which depicts the storm god's cloudy hand. The Victorian chapters, where he's out to sea, are also pretty great. He always seems to be talking or thinking about kinslaying and storms. The two seem to come together like peas and carrots with him. Victorian had thought the same when he met the first storm a day out of Old Volantis. The gods hate kinslayers, he brooded. Elsewise Euron Crowseye would have died a dozen deaths by my hand. As the sea crashed around him and the deck rose and fell beneath his feet, he had seen Dagon's feast and Red Tide slam together so violently that both exploded into splinters. My brother's work, he thought. Well, that about wraps things up for today. In part 2, we are going to cover some more fun stuff about the Ironborn legacy on the Reach, and take a closer look at the current storyline, and even talk about some Walrus and Antler Men, which should be fun. In summation, I tend to interpret some clues that hint towards House Goodbrother being the fertile ancestors of the Grey King's brother, a Garth-type figure. The symbolism noted in the Grey King and House Goodbrother point to some fratricidal connotations. So somewhere in the timeline, it is very possible the Grey King slew his brother. And it's even possible the Hammer of the Waters could have resulted from this specific feud. I'm also going to touch on the Hammer of the Waters in part 2. But before I go, I will leave you to ponder this. Moat Cailin is of course a place where the Hammer of the Waters is rumored to have been called. If you take a look at a map, you will see the closeness of Barrowton to both Moat Cailin and the Iron Islands. Legend says that the great floods that broke the land bridge that is now the Broken Arm and made the Negus Swamp were the work of the Greenseers, who gathered at Moat Cailin to work dark magic. Some contest this, however. The first men were already in Westeros when this occurred, and stemming the tide from the east would do little more than slow their progress. As this passage suggests, the Maesters say the hammer was largely unsuccessful. But what if it wasn't? What if the Hammer of the Waters actually did what it was meant to do? I was on a heresy thread on Westeros.org where we were pondering Moat Cailin and the Children's Tower, because, well, a massive stone fortress isn't really the building style of the Children of the Forest now, is it? What I see this as suggesting is an alignment of the Children of the Forest with at least some of the first men, even during the time of the Hammer of the Waters. So who knows? Maybe the Hammer of the Waters actually did what it was supposed to do. Outside, the wind was sending armies of dead leaves marching across the courtyards to scratch faintly at the doors and windows. The sound made him think of old Nan's stories. He could almost hear the ghostly sentinels calling to each other atop the wall and winding their ghostly war horns. Pale moonlight slanted down through the hole in the dome, painting the branches of the weirwood as they strained up towards the roof. It looked as if the tree was trying to catch the moon and drag it down into the well.